It's often claimed that everything about gender relations and behavior has been said and done, and much indeed has been said. But ultimately, I believe we've only scratched the surface with our inquiries thus far. In this vein, I intend to explore some things in this video from a different perspective, as well as revisit some older topics and some new ones. Throughout the video, my intention is descriptivity. I neither endorse nor oppose any of the phenomena described. I seek to understand. I then observe and report on my observations by trying to come up with hypotheses that fit the data. To begin with, I first have to observe the level of incredulity on the part of many people, particularly those outside of MGTOW circles, when it comes to positing reproductive requirements and limitations as the primary drivers for virtually any form of behavior that actually matters. Much of this incredulity arises from the typical confusion or unawareness regarding proximate and distal cause. Unlike more complex sciences such as physics and its derivatives, biological science is not conceptually difficult to understand, by way of comparison, but our efforts to understand are more often than not foiled by the very evolved nature we seek to scrutinize. For this reason, it seems positively absurd to most people to posit that men enjoying the game Call of Duty has anything to do with reproduction and sex-specific drivers. After all, the game is just plain fun, and it is the fun factor that drives the mostly male player base to play it. But naming fun as a cause tells you nothing as to why it is fun, and furthermore, what is fun for one is hardly fun for another, which is particularly true for the different sexes. Call of Duty as a franchise boasted an alleged and impressive 20% female player base in the year 2013, but even if true, that still leaves a whopping 80%, a huge majority, male. Men, generally speaking, thrive on competition, and male-on-male competition was critical for reproductive success, and when males find success, they are rewarded with the release of the neurotransmitter dopamine in addition to elevated testosterone levels. It sounds weird, doesn't it, that a video game could produce such results, but it is half as weird as the documented increase in testosterone achieved through vicarious winning in sporting events. Basking in reflected glory in which individuals increase their self-esteem by identifying with successful others is usually regarded as a cognitive process that can affect behavior. It may also involve physiological processes, including changes in the production of endocrine hormones. The present research involved 2 studies of changes in testosterone levels among fans watching their favorite sports teams win or lose. In the first study, participants were 8 male fans attending a basketball game between traditional college rivals. In the second study, participants were 21 male fans watching a televised World Cup soccer match between traditional international rivals. Participants provided saliva samples for testosterone assay before and after the contest. In both studies, mean testosterone level increased in the fans of winning teams and decreased in the fans of losing teams. These findings suggest that watching one's heroes win or lose has physiological consequences that extend beyond changes in mood and self-esteem. If indirect participation in loss and victory affects testosterone levels in males watching sporting events, it should hardly be surprising that direct participation in a video game would have similar effects, and in light of this, it's hardly weird. Rather, it makes perfect sense given what we know about men and testosterone. This remains true even if there is little to no direct benefit. I personally know a very competitive and skillful Call of Duty player who happens to be gay. Regardless of his sexual preferences, his biochemistry remains the same, there being no such thing as gay and straight testosterone, even if it does not directly benefit him in pursuit of other males. The theoretical applications remain in place. Elevated testosterone levels promote boldness, greater risk-taking, and the desire for success, all of which are crucial in attempting to court human females. Likewise, those who suffer competitive loss face a demotion in these qualities that could negatively affect their chances of reproductive success. But we needn't stop here, because the plot can always thicken. How did we arrive at such an evolved physiology in males, and why are males generally far more competitive in their activities? This, of course, goes back to the old story of sperm being cheap and eggs being expensive, or the limiting factor in reproduction. An animal that is not reproductively valuable in terms of physiology must display value by other means, and in human males, that means physical and mental activities that allow for competition. Value is then derived from the success achieved in such activities, or the lack thereof. Of course, all of this is old hat, but I wanted to review some of the basics before proceeding onward to new material, and the example above illustrates precisely the point about distinguishing distal and proximate cause and explaining human behavior, because the former tells us next to nothing, whilst the latter tells us the origin, the mechanism, and evolved purpose behind certain forms of human behavior. And yet most people struggle to think of themselves as evolved organisms, possessing attributes in a physiology evolved for the express purpose of reproduction. In an absolute distal sense, reproduction is pretty much everything for any living organism, and humans are no exception, despite most people's inability and still greater unwillingness to wrap their heads around the idea. We've seen time and again evolved reproductive dispositions having a massive influence on the kinds of things men and women do and enjoy respectively, the types of games they play, the types of work they favor, the general activities they engage in, and even, as I had hypothesized in the riddle of the pumpkin spice latte, how the sexes interact with the internet and websites. Given all this, we know that men and women tend to choose differently in terms of their political priorities as well, and much has been said about female tendencies, but comparatively little has been said about the male side of things in terms of motivations and how evolution may have shaped some of the outcomes we can observe. However, before I proceed to that topic, I want to introduce something new and previously not discussed that is relevant to the topic at hand, and that is assortative mating. Assortative mating entails a specific mating pattern and type of sexual selection whereby the animal, including the human animal, shows preference for mating and selection with individuals of similar genotypes and phenotypes than with those who lack such similar genotypical and phenotypical traits. Sometimes assortative mating is referred to as positive assortative mating or homogamy. The opposite of assortative mating is disassortative mating, where individuals mate with greater frequency with others of dissimilar phenotypes and genotypes. Naturally, assortative mating leads to increases in genetic relatedness, and disassortative mating leads to less genetic relatedness. Although assortative mating is found in many animal species, I specifically want to focus on its occurrence within humans. It should be noted that in humans, assortative sexual selection criteria can be extended to memotypical features in addition to phenotypical and genotypical ones. Early on in the beginning of the 20th century, studies were conducted on husbands and wives, revealing strong correlations between them in terms of height, span of arms, as well as other features. Assortative mating preferences extend, as mentioned above, to levels of education, socioeconomic status, politics, which is to say memotypical traits, and of course race and ethnicity, the last of which I will be returning to later in greater detail. Neither assortative mating nor disassortative mating are in and of themselves good. They are merely strategies used to optimize fitness in individuals. In humans, assortative mating can increase feelings of kinship and consequently parental investment. Conversely, too much indulgence in assortative mating can lead to decreases in genetic fitness. A classic example of this would be marriage between first cousins as general practice, which over generations leads to an overrepresentation of certain diseases, unattractive features, asymmetries, and other undesirable traits, i.e., excessive emphasis on assortative practices leads to consanguinity, or more colloquially put, inbredness. I'm spending a fair bit of time on the topic of assortative mating because, as I shall propose later, I believe it to be key in understanding several critical behaviors in human males. But for the time being, I shall turn away from the topic and talk about something else. We now return to war bride theory. War bride theory proposes that the optimal reproductive strategy for women in difficult warlike or human conflict-rich situations is that of flexible allegiance and loyalty. Why is flexibility of allegiance theorized to be an optimal survival and reproductive strategy for women? Whereas males are viewed as combatants or enemies, every female is a potential childbearer. Men were more likely to be systematically cut down, and women more likely to be preserved for the sake of mating potential. If this had been a repeated pattern across multiple scores of generations, this could absolutely be a hardwired factor in this type of behavior. Multiple historical instances of this have been documented, such as during World War II and after. During World War II, women from many European countries had liaisons and relationships with the German soldiers. And after the war had ended, German women had relations with American soldiers. Some snippets. In the decade after World War II, more than 100,000 babies were born to unwed German mothers and Allied soldier fathers. Most of the men left Europe without ever meeting their children. Now, many quote-unquote occupation babies are scrambling to find their fathers before it's too late. And similar such things happened in post-World War II Japan. 70 years ago, many Japanese people in occupied Tokyo after World War II saw U.S. troops as the enemy. But tens of thousands of young Japanese women married GIs nonetheless, and then faced a big struggle to find their place in the U.S. This type of female reproductive opportunism, which allows for maximum flexibility in terms of acquiring the most important goods in the eyes of women, namely security, protection, and resources, which in turn increases female reproductive chances, as well as basic survival chances, cannot find any reproductive mirror in the human male for reasons equally as compelling as the reasons that had led to female reproductive opportunism. This is well illustrated by the fairly recent events in the Balkans during the 1990s. C.S. MGTOW had put out a truly exceptional video covering some of those events, with the focus being on post-collapse scenarios for men. In it, he cited a paper detailing how the Balkan conflict disproportionately had affected men in a negative manner. The abstract reads as follows. Of all non-combatants in the former Yugoslavia, adult civilian men were most likely to be massacred by enemy forces. Why, therefore, did international agencies mandated with the quote-unquote protection of civilians evacuate women and children, but not military-age men, from besieged areas? This article reviews the operational dilemmas faced by protection workers in the former Yugoslavia when negotiating access to civilian populations. I argue that a social constructivist approach incorporating gender analysis is required to explain both the civilian protection community's discourse and its operational behavior. First, gender beliefs constitute discursive strategies on which civilian protection advocacy is based. Second, gender norms operate in practice to constrain the options available to protection workers in assisting civilians. These two causal pathways converged in the former Yugoslavia to produce effects disastrous to civilians, particularly adult men and male adolescents. Furthermore, consider the wars of secession in the former Yugoslavia. Of the 18,000 missing persons after the wars, the ICRC estimated that 92% were men and only 8% women. Although many died as soldiers, reluctant conscripts, or in detention centers and forced labor camps, others were the victim of highly discriminate massacres, in which military-age male civilians were separated from women, children, and the elderly, and executed while the latter were permitted to flee. This pattern was established early in the war within the towns that had fallen in the Bosnian Serb army. When the debate over whether to evacuate began, senior protection officers at the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees insisted that only persons facing a quote-unquote acute life-threatening situation should be evacuated. Quote, "Our responsibility, as we see it, is to alleviate the suffering of vulnerable groups," end quote, read a UNHCR field report in December 1993. Yet when humanitarian agencies later began to evacuate, quote, vulnerable civilians en masse from war zones, the evacuees were nearly always women, children, and the elderly. Able-bodied military-age male civilians, precisely those civilians most likely to be killed or detained on suspicion of engaging in hostilities, were almost never given safe passage, along with their families. Why? I will disagree with the author's assertion that one needs a social constructivist approach to understand what went on. Gender beliefs absolutely do constitute the basis on which civilian protection and rescue are carried out, but we would be far better informed by an evolutionary perspective rather than a so-called socially constructed one. The why of the matter is precisely what we need to understand. Men in the Balkans were the losing demographic in terms of survival in that conflict. Flexible allegiance and opportunism in the female are only possible because of the perceived value of the female, meaning her reproductive capacity. The abstract and the paragraph from the publication give a first-hand account of why such strategy of opportunism is inconceivable to a man, who is far more likely to be cut down or shot in the worst-case scenario and simply abandoned in the best-case scenario. With that said, gynocentrism operates on a sliding scale of degree. In previous centuries or millennia ago, rather than being rescued, women might have been enslaved or snatched away from their tribes, whilst the men of that tribe would have been massacred outright. This is where degree comes into play, because even under less than ideal circumstances, such scenarios still offer the chance of survival and reproductive success for women. This can also be illustrated by way of information about several indigenous tribes of the Amazon, particularly the Yanomami. Violence is one of the leading causes of Yanomami death. Up to half of all Yanomami males die violent deaths in the constant conflict between neighboring communities over local resources. Often these confrontations lead to the Yanomami leaving their villages in search of new ones. Women are often victims of physical abuse and anger. Inter-village warfare is common, but does not too commonly affect women. When Yanomami tribes fight and raid nearby tribes, Women are often raped, beaten, and brought back to the Shabono to be adopted into the captor's community. Wives may be beaten frequently so as to keep them docile and faithful to their husbands. Sexual jealousy causes much of the violence. Women are beaten with clubs, sticks, machetes, and other blunt or sharp objects. Burning with a branding stick occurs often as well, and symbolizes a male's strength or dominance over his wife. Now, no one can claim that this is pristine treatment of women, but gynocentrism is a sliding scale. Whilst fully half the men die, the women, though poorly treated, survive to reproduce, and the infographic you see now gives you an idea of the degree of violent deaths males experience in primitive societies. Once again, poor treatment in life, as well as the ability to reproduce, are better options than death, which is the end for all possibilities of genetic replication. I've spent considerable time on the differences between how men and women are treated in conflict-heavy zones and societies, so as to drive home the point that such vast differences, when spread out over countless millennia, will lead to highly internalized and differentiated survival and reproductive strategies in men and women respectively, that have been unconsciously integrated into their psychologies. I hope I have presented sufficient evidence to explain the basis of female reproductive opportunism, but the actual focus of this video is the strategies employed by men in situations of conflict, life and death, and general psychological pressure. Clearly, female strategies cannot be applied to men, and therefore other strategies must have evolved to optimize, however poorly, male survival and reproductive success. One of the main reasons I originally decided to pursue this topic was the rise of left-leaning nationalism and fascism in Europe, as well as white nationalism. I continuously found the lack of female participation compared to male to be a subject of great fascination, and hypothesized that such a great divide in participation can best be explained by means of evolutionary pressures as primary drivers. The first types of pressure I shall cover will be biosocial in nature, eventually moving towards actual biophysiological pressures that drive participation in movements of ethnic purity and the like. EDL supporters are young, male, and anti-immigration, says survey. Supporters of the English Defence League are overwhelmingly young men who mistrust others and are deeply pessimistic about the future, according to the first significant study of the UK's most provocative street movement for 30 years. The report said that almost 3/4 of EDL supporters in an online survey were under the age of 30, and 81% were male. Further data taken from a study called Inside the EDL, Populist Politics in a Digital Age, revealed the following. Overall, 81% of the EDL's current Facebook group membership, there are a number of EDL Facebook groups, is male, and 19% is female. Of respondents to our survey, 14% were female and 86% were male. I do realize that the EDL is not truly a white nationalist movement, but practically speaking, its composition is similar enough for the purposes of study. All this information was taken in 2011, but I'd be willing to bet the bank that there's been little shift in the gender demographics, and thus I still believe this information to be applicable at the current time, as such gender divergence participation is almost certainly not coincidental. We have the information, and now we need to dissect it properly. Since female reproductive opportunism is a non-viable strategy for men, in order to survive, needed to do something else, namely form coalitions directed towards a common goal, most often survival and opposing perceived threats, whether real or imagined, which would fit in with such an organization as the EDL. These coalitions will invariably be filled with other men from the in-group, and now we can slowly return to the topic of assortative mating. Although strictly speaking, assortative mating is only applicable to sexual selection, I propose that, as with many such things, there are derived spandrels that branch off from the direct reproductive benefit but remain closely related to the sorting algorithm of assortative mating, which is what we find in such male coalitions, which in the case of the EDL is English and white, which would primarily represent similar phenotypical traits bringing such men together, and secondarily memotypical traits derived from the phenotypical, such as ideological belief, perception of a threat by the other, etc. From an evolutionary perspective, the necessity of such coalitions is clear. Without a reproductive get-out-of-jail card of the sort women have, namely the uterus, and its predefined value as a limiting factor in reproduction, the best chances of survival are to be found in closely knit groups of phenotypically and memotypically similar male individuals. Such a coalition working together and in unison is much more likely to survive hostile confrontation than a lone man ever could, and such in-group coalitions offer similar benefit in offensive contexts in addition to increasing the reproductive chances of the men participating, which can be seen once again looking at the practices of the primitive Yanomami in the Amazon. Though many Yanomami are peaceful, many are fierce warriors. Sometimes their warring is to capture women, so that their best warriors can maximize their reproductive success. In general, warring villages are usually several days' walk from each other, whereas tranquil ones may be less than a day. Villages will usually fission when the population reaches 100 to 150 people, but in times of warfare, villages will not split before they reach a population of around 300 individuals. Villages may go to war for a number of reasons, and warfare makes up a large part of Yanomami life. About 40% of adult males have killed another person, and about 25% of adult males will die from some form of violence. Violence will vary from chest pounding, in which opponents take turns hitting each other on the chest, to raids which may involve killing of individuals and abducting women, to all-out warfare. This illustrates not only the usefulness of male assortative coalitions for defense and survival, but also for reproductive success, since after successful raids, new women enter the in-group via capture or abduction. This also illustrates the reproductive and survival necessity of female sexual opportunism, as a female not deemed pliant and cooperative would likely be killed. And I propose that loyalty as an abstract, which is typically a masculine trait, ultimately evolved from this life or death need to form assortative coalitions in the face of environmental and oppositional human danger. The soldier risking life and limb to save his wounded comrade is displaying an evolved behavior wherein he risks his own safety for the good of the group, because assortative cohesion demands it on a psychological level. Of course, in the context of a national military force, the assortative element tends to be more memotypical, rather than phenotypical and or genotypical, and the nationalism and jingoism commonly found in the military help to reinforce the memes that bind the group together. Similarly, assortative coalitional factors would play a role in men's superior ability to engage in teamwork, yielding maximum results as a consequence of team effort, whether in an office environment or field in war. But we have, in fact, only scratched the surface of assortative factors playing a role in ideological and political adherence. Thus far, I have only touched upon the very direct consequences of men not being able to engage in reproductive opportunism, and the sometimes phenotypical and memotypical drivers behind in-group coalitions and cooperation. One of the main reproductive drivers behind male behavior is the need for paternal assurance. A woman obviously always knows that the child she is carrying is her own, but a man has no such guarantee. This is true across multiple species, but our focus is on human males. Human males must find means of improving their paternal certainty, lest they waste precious resources on offspring that are not genetically related. And given this, I wish to introduce the idea that paternity insurance is in fact a large factor behind the ideological interest in white nationalism and racial purity. But I maintain that the male tendency to adhere to ethnic ideologies, such as white nationalism, is a spandrel of a larger sorting algorithm rooted in the assortative mating process, and that human females' lack of interest in such ethnically driven movements, generally speaking, is derived from a much lesser focus on assortative principles for sexual selection than men, given that they do not have the issue of paternity assurance. But before wading into the biological details of that, we must first observe that white nationalism is almost always overrepresented by males, with comparatively little female participation, usually along the lines of what could be gleaned from the studies on the EDL, which is not white nationalist per se, but possesses some of the features. Some excerpts from these articles anecdotally tell us more about the perennial problem of lack of women in white nationalism. The perennial question is back. Why are there so few women in the white nationalist movement? Before venturing an analysis of this question, I need to say a few words about what white nationalism is. White nationalism is about preserving the biological integrity of the white race by making our race's survival and flourishing the number one political priority. White nationalists represent the genetic interests of all whites, men and women, adults and children. But preserving our race's biological integrity requires more than defeating multiculturalism and multiracialism. It also requires the defeat of feminism and emasculation, that is, male infantilization, and the restoration of sexual roles that are not just traditional, but also biological, men as protectors and providers, women as nurturers. And why aren't more women involved in the white nationalist movement? There is a conversation going on about this in the comments. It's such an interesting topic that it warrants a separate thread. Everyone who has attended a white nationalist convention has noticed that men are always drastically overrepresented. So it is well documented that white nationalism is a proverbial sausage fest, but the question is, why? I do not believe it is because, as some women claim, such men are so-called wounded soldiers or misogynists, but rather, I believe there is an inherent mechanism in men that predisposes them on average to be more concerned with notions of racial purity as an indirect consequence of their requirements for paternity assurance. The following information will be helpful here, taken from the publication Preference for Facial Self-Resemblance in Human Mate Choice. Empirical studies present considerably consistent data about human mate choice, from which we may infer that it tends to be homogamous for various traits. However, different experiments on facial resemblance led to contradictory results. To obtain additional data about the preference for self-resembling potential mates, male and female composite faces were modified in a manner to resemble subjects. Volunteers were asked to choose a potential partner from 3 images in different situations: self-resembling faces, non-resembling faces, both with the same degree of other-related attractiveness, and images which were rated by others as more attractive than the self-resembling faces. Women did not show any preference for similarity. They preferred the most attractive male and female faces. In contrast, men preferred the most attractive images of the opposite sex to self-resembling faces, and the self-resembling faces to non-resembling faces. The self-resemblance of same-sex faces was preferred by neither men nor women. Our results support the hypothesis that both facial similarity, i.e., cues of shared genes, and observer-independent features of attractiveness, i.e., honest signals of genetic quality, play an important role in male mate choice. The lack of choice for self-resemblance on the female side in this particular study might reflect their more complex decision-making rules that are probably based on other cues beside visual stimuli. Specifically for men, a significant difference was found among the images of Tableau 2, where opposite sex images of matched attractiveness were compared, and on Tableau 4, where opposite sex morphs of various attractiveness were judged. This means that when attractiveness level was controlled, the self-resembling female face was preferred by male subjects. But in the condition of varying attractiveness, the most attractive female face was chosen by significantly more subjects in the first place, compared to chance level. Further analysis of Tableau 4 revealed out of the subjects who had chosen the most attractive female face first, significantly more subjects, i.e. 24 men, preferred the self-resembling female face on the second rank than the non-resembling face. And for women, preference for self-resemblance was found neither for same-sex faces in Tableau 1, nor for the opposite-sex faces in Tableau 2. This means that female participants preferred the most attractive male and female morphs over the self-resembling faces. However, females showed a slight tendency to give higher rank to the same-sex face, which has been found the most attractive by the independent judges than males, whereas men's ranking was somewhat biased for opposite-sex images with high attractiveness compared to that of females. This study reveals an interesting find. Assortative principles in sexual selection are significantly stronger in males than in females. Additionally, the female tendency to give a higher rank to the same-sex face also indicates greater female sexual fluidity than to be found in males, as well as the female same-sex in-group preference, both of which are well documented. I believe that the self-resemblance preference shown in males, but lacking in females, is an evolved mechanism meant to optimize paternal outcomes, since children born to parents resembling each other will leave less room for doubt as to paternal certainty, and thus there are fewer chances of paternal investment in non-genetically related offspring. By way of stark contrast, however, women displayed no such preference, which of course makes sense since certainty of genetic relatedness is never an issue for mothers, and consequently there can be no such thing as maternal malinvestment. But that's not everything. I want to further buttress the argument I'm making by adducing additional evidence demonstrating that the assortative principle is necessarily much stronger in males than in females. I will now spend a while talking about something seemingly unrelated, namely eye color. According to a study published in 2008, everyone with blue eyes has the exact same ancestor from over 7,000 years ago, who was born somewhere in the Black Sea region with the mutation. Professor Hans Eyberg from the Department of Cellular and Molecular Medicine at the University of Copenhagen states, quote, A genetic mutation affecting the Oca2 gene in our chromosomes resulted in the creation of a quote-unquote switch which literally turned off the ability to produce brown eyes, end quote. Professor Aberg, through exhaustive study from the year 1996, traveled to areas of the world like Turkey, Jordan, Denmark to study the eye color blue. Through this study of the mitochondrial DNA, the professor discovered the location of the gene for eye color. The Oca2 gene is programmed to produce melanin, which is responsible for hair and skin color, as well as eye color. The switch is located adjacent to the Oca2 gene and actually only inhibits the melanin-producing abilities to a small extent, thus creating the blue eyes instead of an area completely void of melanin. When melanin is completely absent, human beings experience albino characteristics. Taking a closer look at this process enables us to understand why the eye color blue is derived from one ancestor. Since this eye color comes from an exact variance in melanin, it is considered to be a marker passed from a single ancestor. In individuals with green or hazel eyes, the color variances are more random in change and cannot be pinned down to a single occurrence. Prior to this mutation, all humans had only brown eyes. This is known as the founder effect. In population genetics, the founder effect refers to the loss of genetic variation that occurs when a population can be traced to a very small number of individuals. All blue-eyed people possess an identical DNA sequence with respect to melanin production, which, given its recent occurrence, allows it to easily be traced back to a single mitochondrial or female ancestor. I had originally intended to spend a great deal of time on eye color inheritance genetics, but realized that going over such a topic would throw off the focus of the video, and thus I have decided to upload a video at a later date on that topic, which is fairly complex and makes for interesting scientific learning. But without getting into further unnecessary details, the practical chances of two blue-eyed parents having a blue-eyed child are around 75%, with brown being at 25%, and simultaneously we must remain aware that the alleles responsible for blue eyes are recessive, but those for brown eyes are dominant. Let's hold on to those percentages because they are relevant to what will be observed later. In fact, in spite of brown-eyed dominant alleles, large percentages of blue-eyed people are represented throughout Europe, though primarily in the north, which tells you something, that despite the singularity-like nature of the genetic advent of blue eyes, the large percentages of blue-eyed Europeans suggest that large numbers of blue-eyed people reproduce over the course of millennia, hence the aforementioned founder effect. It's important to mention this as I return to assortative mating, since there have been data that demonstrate that blue-eyed men universally prefer blue-eyed women, but blue-eyed women do not favor any eye color over the other, as a study cites. Quote, "The human eye color blue reflects a simple, predictable, and reliable genetic mechanism of inheritance. Blue-eyed individuals represent a unique condition, as in their case there is always direct concordance between the genotype and phenotype. On the other hand, heterozygous brown-eyed individuals carry an allele that is not concordant with the observed eye color. Hence, eye color can provide a highly visible and salient clue to the child's heredity. If men choose women with characteristics that promote the assurance of paternity, then blue-eyed men should prefer and feel more attracted towards women with blue eyes." To test these predictions, close-up photos of young women and adult men with either blue or brown eyes were rated for their attractiveness by young women and men observers with either blue or brown eyes. The eye color in the photographs of each model was manipulated so that the same face would be shown with either the natural eye color, e.g. blue, or with the other color, e.g. brown. Both blue-eyed and brown-eyed female participants showed no difference in their attractiveness rating for male models of either eye color. Similarly, brown-eyed men showed no preference for either blue-eyed or brown-eyed female models. However, blue-eyed men rated as more attractive the blue-eyed women than the brown-eyed ones. We interpret the latter preference in terms of specific mate-selective choice of blue-eyed men, reflecting strategies for reducing paternity uncertainty. In a second study, a group of young adults of both sexes and different eye colors, blue, brown, and green, were asked to report the eye and hair color of their romantic partners. Their responses indicated the presence of assortative mating by eye color as well, and to a lesser degree for hair color. Most importantly, blue-eyed male respondents were the group with the largest proportions of partners of the same eye color. These findings, number 1, indicate that blue-eyed men do prefer women with the same eye color, and 2, specifically suggest that the presence of a male adaptation for the detection of extra-pair paternity based on eye color as a phenotypically based assurance of paternity, i.e., when the father's and offspring's phenotypes match, and as a defense against cuckoldry, i.e., when the phenotypes do not match. What is interesting here is that within a few millennia, blue-eyed men evolved an effective reproductive algorithm for mate selection, and given the roughly 75% likelihood of blue-eyed offspring from blue-eyed parents, this makes sense. I would also argue that the proliferation of blue eyes in Europe, compared to other regions of the world, is a direct result of men unconsciously employing this strategy for the sake of paternity assurance, and blue-eyed women being more responsive to the degree of parental investment the blue-eyed men were willing to offer, rather than any preference for blue eyes on their part. The stronger male tendency towards assortative mating principles also explains men's on average greater interest in looks. Whereas women need to focus on both genetic fitness and willingness to provide resources, men need to focus on genetic fitness and paternity assurance, which I would argue makes men scrutinize the details of female physical appearance to a greater degree, because studying such details can yield important clues for paternity assurance, and the man can thereby avoid a penalty of ruinous misallocation of time and resources in the future. Just as men generally prefer female faces that resemble their own, so too do blue-eyed men prefer women that also have eyes that resemble their own. My hypothesis is thus that an important part of the drive to form coalitions focused on ethnocentrism and white nationalism can be derived from the reproductive need for paternity assurance. I am not, however, asserting that this is a straight line, but rather a spandrel, in much the same way I would posit language to be a spandrel of certain brain and vocal organ developments, rather than a linearly evolved faculty. And in this same way, I would describe the greater male tendency for ideological rigidity and ideological interest to be a convergence of several delimitative reproductive factors. We see this in women as well. Women practice reproductive opportunism because selection pressures favor that approach as optimal for them. They are also ideologically and politically more malleable than men for similar reasons, swinging with the times, as it were, which we can see, for example, in how they tend to vote Republican or Democrat in the United States, depending on their marital status, and how once pious National Socialist women later became impregnated by victorious American GIs. An almost opposite strategy seems to have developed in men. Rather than presenting maximal flexibility and opportunism, men appear to dig their boots into the ground and form assortative coalitions combining phenotypical, memotypical, and sometimes genotypical preferences that are characterized by ideological rigidity and inflexibility, because any loose thread in the greater tapestry of such a group would be detrimental to its success and consequently the lives of the individual men involved. An enemy that offers no quarter or life or death threat simply does not allow for flexibility. Prehistorically, it was either kill or be killed, and male survival and reproductive strategy are a result of that. If we look again at the typical membership of the EDL or of movements that are explicitly white nationalists, my hypothesis is supported by the data. Young, overwhelmingly white men under the age of 30, meaning more or less in prime reproductive age, forming a nationalist ethnic-based group in defense against perceived threats. Its structure and composition fit neatly with the theory I am proposing. Of course, this would be a general rule rather than an absolute, but the data do support the proposition I have made. Men, whether black, white, or Asian, spend much more time speaking of quote-unquote their women in a manner not shared by their female counterparts. Korean men get upset at white men dating and marrying quote-unquote their women. Black men get upset at black women dating and marrying white men, and white men get upset at the prospects of jungle fever. The obsession and interest in this can almost certainly be derived from the assortative principles discussed in this video. This might just be a general rule, but having a clear picture of the evolved behavior behind such tendencies can go a long way in helping us explain human phenomena that would otherwise have no plausible explanation. As usual, links are in the low bar. Thanks for watching.